There's a reason why we just spent the last 4 or 5 tutorials talking about the different routing options in your DAW. And that's because now, as we move on to this idea of the mixed pyramid, we're going to be talking about how you apply these different routing options and how to think about them in relation to the mix that you're working on. And in my opinion, probably close to 85, 90, even maybe 95% of the mixes that you are going to complete and that are completed follow this basic structure and this basic guideline for going about the mixing process. And you might hear this referred to as the mix hierarchy, mixing levels, mixing tiers. But fundamentally, they all mean basically the same thing. And for me, having a pyramid works as a great visualization for this. If you're working on, say, classical music and you're mixing that, this approach probably isn't going to be used because you're just going to end up over processing things. And with classical or orchestral music, the whole point is to just get as clean a recording as possible. And then you're assuming the people listening to that are doing so on hi-fi systems or in relatively noise-less environment, so to speak. So as we go through this, you're going to be really in a pretty good place in terms of the knowledge that you have, and you're going to see how these routing options now apply to the mix on the grander scale, so to speak. Quickly, let's do a little bit of a review because we're now kind of reaching that point here in the mixing section where it's all going to speed up and we're going to start talking about the techniques and the tools. But so far, we've talked about the mindset, getting in the right state of mind to mix. We've talked about preparation. We've talked about fundamentally the rough mix, the thing that sets the stage for everything that you're going to do moving forward. Volume and pan being the two attributes on each individual track that you're setting. And then we just finished up discussing the routing options. And it's important with at least these first 3 bullets to understand that each of those is of equal importance. And of everything that we talk about moving forward, if those 3 things are not done and are not done to the best of your ability, and again, we're all different, so the best of our ability is going to vary. If they're not done to the best of your ability, you're really behind the 8 ball, and you're probably working backwards instead of working forwards and moving to a really nice finished product. So what lies ahead? And this is what I was just previewing a second ago. What we're going to do in this presentation is define the pyramid, talk about this idea of a hierarchy of layers, of levels, of tiers, again, all meaning the same general thing. And we're going to, within those layers, within those levels, within those tiers, establish some kind of significance, meaning what are the relative importance levels of each of those groups. So the thing on the bottom is obviously the most important and influences the thing in the middle, and those two then influence the thing on the top. So this is going to be a lot of, kind of corny house analogies to making sure you start with a steady and strong foundation. Those sort of things we're going to be talking about in this presentation. We'll then move on and begin to discuss and talk about the various tools that you're going to use in the mixing process. And spoiler alert, we're familiar with all of them thus far. Some of them just are going to look a little bit different, perhaps sound a little bit different, but no effect that we're going to be bringing in here is going to throw you for a loop. It's not like suddenly now there's 10 different categories and 50 new effects to learn. No, it's really about how you apply them, and that's the final bullet here. So the actual techniques, what it means to think about an EQ as a mix engineer versus thinking about an EQ as somebody who's making the music. And what it really boils down to here is just context. So as a mix engineer, you're really focused on hearing how do these sounds really kind of interact with one another, and what do I have to do to either enhance something, maybe pull something back a little so that they all now sit and act and work as a nice, good, happy family, so to speak. Whereas when you're making the music, some of it's really about speed, getting the sound in the general ballpark, and then moving on so that you don't break that creative flow. So here we are now defining the actual levels to the pyramid. And as I wrote here, this image is set to scale, meaning that the most important thing that you set up is that rough mix, is working at the track level. So each individual track, getting its position right in the stereo spectrum, getting its volume level right. And this is what I would define then as, building the foundation. You might already know where you want to put a TV or where you want to put your pool table, but what does that matter if the house doesn't have a sturdy foundation? One big gust of wind and it all blows away, and you now don't even have those really nice whatever consumer products that you want to enjoy, the luxury goods, so to speak. And I would define the luxury goods really as the master bus, which is all the way there at the top. But also what the pyramid does for us visually is show that you need to get the track level right before you can move on to the groups, as well as the send and return structure. Because, for example, you wouldn't just pull everything up and then determine what value you want to be sending into what you have on the returns. Because then as you start to set your tracks and get the balances right, that goes totally out of whack. So getting the tracks right first, moving on to then group processing, as well as send and returns. And then those two are what's going to influence what you do on the master bus. And if you are a beginner and new to mixing, I strongly encourage that you leave the master bus processing until the very end for the reason I'm going to talk about in just a second. So let's again go through what this really means, what the mix pyramid is showing us, what it's establishing, and hopefully after you've gone through those routing videos, you now understand where you would be putting the various effects. So for the master, you're putting that on the master channel. For the groups, you're putting that on the groups channel. For the tracks themselves, you're going on the tracks by track basis. The track level is by far the most important thing to focus on, and I put here get right in quotations because again, this is all subjective. So what sounds right to you? So you want to do your effect processing on the track level first, get everything to blend before moving on to the groups and then ultimately the master. The groups, aka the return tracks, I shouldn't say aka, also the return tracks because they're different, are integrally linked to the tracks, to the foundation, which will subsequently affect the way that you process the groups. So if you process the groups first, that would affect then how you would go in and process the tracks, but it's a backwards way of thinking. You want to start with the tracks first, and then that's going to shape anything that you do at that group level. And finally, the master bus processing is based on both tracks and groups, and ultimately, here's the key, only enhances your mix based on what you've set at those lower two levels, at the groups and at the tracks. So this is why I say leave the master bus processing to the end, because we're all about enhancing the mix that we've made, not kind of mixing to the master, which is another strategy that can be used and can be used very effectively for certain styles of music, which would mean, for example, you would set your track levels to begin with in kind of a rough mix, and then you'd throw stuff on the master bus, and then you would go back and kind of affect things further, get to the groups and whatever. But as a beginner getting into mixing, this is more about enhancement. You want your mix to speak for itself, and anything you put on the master is just going to maybe push it that much further, make it that much better or more exciting to listen to. But all the cool kids say so. All the cool kids say you should do it the other way. Well, in reality, the pyramid can be inverted for tutorial popularity that I'm sure you've seen on YouTube and even in a lot of magazines and on different sites, meaning that where we have tracks at the bottom, you'd actually see master bus, and that's what all of the focus is on in tutorials and in articles, and then, groups and returns kind of stay in the middle, and then tracks go all the way up there at the very top. So like I wrote, most of the really popular tutorials that discuss mixing tend to focus on what you do on the master bus and the relevant effect chains. So why is this? Why does it exist this way? Clearly, if there's so much volume and so much interest on master bus processing, that must be the most important part of the mix process, right? And no, it really isn't. There's nothing that technical or complex about processing individual tracks, working with volume and pan, throwing an EQ on something, putting an EQ on that individual track. It's pretty straightforward. It's pretty easy to understand. Therefore, you get this idea of mixing secrets from, the great masters of our time and how they take their mix to the next level. And it's true, master bus processing can give your mix that extra 2 or 3%. But it still can't replace setting good balances to start with. And I've talked about this before. It's all about creating good habits. Good working habits are ultimately going to pay off in the end. You don't want to take shortcuts. And the whole thing with master bus processing is it's the easiest thing to do. It's the easiest thing to watch somebody do. It's the easiest place where so many different plugins come out and you're like, ooh, this one looks cool. And I wonder how it sounds. It's just so easy to drag and drop one thing on the master bus as compared to spending the 2 hours hours or an hour it might take to just set those relative balances. There's nothing sexy about that. And in a lot of ways, there's nothing fun about that either, but it really sets you up for then when you maybe get to these processes later on. And also, there's like an unlimited number of variations and strategies and approaches people have to working on the master bus. But again, it's really only adding that extra 2 or 3%. So you got to get the 97% right first if you're going to be able to enhance or boost your mix to, quote unquote, that next level. And there's also this idea and debate amongst people because people just love to compare things and make top 10 lists. There's this whole, debates raging on about, the one plugin to rule them all, or what's the best thing to put on the master bus. Like, what's the best compressor for the master bus? What's the best EQ for the master bus? And, the answer is there isn't a best one, right? It always depends. It always varies. And really, what you choose isn't going to make or break your mix. And it could break your mix if you push things a little bit too far or maybe choose the wrong pairing. So still, it's about using your ears and deciding, is this doing something to help what I've done before? Or is it hurting what I had before? And if it's hurting what you've had before, and based on your opinion from listening, then you just leave it off. As well, here I have this idea of impact, okay? And a lot of these plugins that you drop on, no matter where you put them, for example, especially these like analog emulated plugins, they just add level without even doing anything. And what's louder always sounds better to us. So you drag and drop your processor on there and you're like, whoa, suddenly this has this whole new dimension to it. It's colored the sound. Well, probably it's just made it a little bit louder, so you're hearing more of the detail, and you might be perceiving more than is actually going on. So there's the placebo effect, and trust me, in mixing, the placebo effect is very strong. That being said, if you do put a processor on the master track and you put in some settings, it can be pretty obvious and easy to hear as compared to some of the really subtle moves that you might make earlier on. So people love to be like, ooh, okay, I can hear the A B to this. This is making a big impact. Whereas it's more important, again, to start from the beginning and get things where you want them to be. So let's go ahead and do kind of an analogy here. And instead of doing a house analogy, which is kind of the classic one, we're going to go and look at this from a pictorial or fine arts perspective. And here's where my own opinion and bias comes into play. So I know some of you are going to be like, oh God, he's going to show us pictures again. But yeah, I mean, that happens to be one of my strengths. So I'm going to play to my strengths. The fine art world, and really just any kind of images in general, including, photography or film, illustrate a great analogy for the mix process and the mixing pyramid that we've just spent some time defining. Music's past, specifically orchestration, how you arrange players on a stage, is useful but deals with arrangement and I'd say a mix for live music, not one final product, aka the final master. And this final master is designed to be listened to and enjoyed by a wide variety of people, all listening back on a wide variety of playback mediums. So some people are listening on earbuds, some people are listening on hi-fi systems, some people are listening to their car radio. That's very different from orchestration, where it's live music and you have a stage, the music is projected, and you ideally want to sit everybody in such a way and get such a dynamic and a volume where it sounds good to people sitting way in the back as compared to people sitting up front. But it's a different way of thinking than the way we approach modern mixing and coming out with that one final track at the end, which everybody is going to ultimately then consume, and a lot of times at a compressed sort of fashion. So, you lose some quality by going to MP3. Those are things that you're thinking about and considering. When it's live music and arranging people on a stage, although it is useful to look at that, and when we have the mixing perspectives course, we'll spend a lot of time talking about orchestration. But for now, it's honestly not that relevant for our mixes and what we're trying to come up with. And this is why we're going to go through this pictorial/fine arts analogy here. So how does a painting begin? It begins with a canvas. So this is the starting point. It's just a blank project. You open it up. You haven't even brought in the stems, but you have your canvas, and this is where you're going to begin. So we then have this idea of priming the canvas or prepping the canvas. So in this case, this is a gesso brush, which is going to be then spread over the canvas. And sometimes people will use things like sandpaper or all sorts of crazy materials to try to get their canvas primed and ready to go to actually paint on. And so this is similar in the mixing stage to bringing in all your stems, sorting them around. You're kind of getting in that mindset to mix, just like if you're priming a canvas, you're getting your mindset ready to start painting, but you're not quite there yet, but you want to set yourself up for success. And that's where preparation in mixing is so important. And then what you have after you've brought everything in is you have all of those elements. So they're all just sitting there, and specifically in a mix, you're just listening back to all of them and you're like, okay, these are all kind of clashing. They're all on top of each other. I know I'm going to need to move them around, but this is where you'd go right before setting those initial balances. And if you're an artist, you've probably at some point done some sketches, so you have an idea of the balances, but you also might just be thinking, okay, I know I want to do a landscape. So what are the elements that I'm going to have in my landscape? Is the sun going to be visible? What direction is the light going to move? Am I going to have trees in this image? Is it going to be water? What is it I'm painting? Those are the elements, okay? Those are what is going to make up the picture, just like all of your stems are what ultimately are going to make up your mix. And then we'd move on to, of course, the rough balance. So you can see that some things have changed here. We've moved things around. We've put them in perspective with one another. We're clearly defining here, these different levels, these different layers. We've kind of created a little bit of a perspective. Something is more so popping out at us, even though it's smaller as compared to some things pushing in the background. Everything has its space to breathe, and you can see how everything kind of fits with each other. Same idea with your rough balance, okay? We're not changing the colors. We're not doing anything too crazy and complicated. We're just letting everything exist in its own space and making sure that it's not tripping over itself, okay? So that's the idea with the rough balance. Then we move on to the cohesion and enhancement. And this is what I would then call the group / the effect return processing that you do. So now we have colors that really complement each other. We've gone in and got a little bit fancy with the fills that we've put in around these shapes. Okay. All of these things are just kind of cohesion enhancements that are making this more listenable to everyone. And it also is making more sense to us. So we can go back. We started here to here, now to here. And then the second part of this is what I would call more of the mastering stage, and even what we might be doing with our master bus processing. So you can see that we crop things in a little bit. We've saturated the hell out of it, kind of like what happens if you try to make a mix really, really loud and kind of like, bright in your face. That was the idea with the additional saturation and some of the effect processing that we've done to the background. We've really just tried to make the whole thing pop out a little bit more. But if we started here and put that on top of our elements, it would make absolutely no sense. It would just be a mess. It would probably be very difficult to then push things out the way that we did in our process here of coming up with this final image. And it's the same idea and same sort of concepts that you're going to be applying to the mix and to the mix pyramid. So one final time. You guys know I say this. I've probably said it 5 or 6 times. If you're doing a drinking game, you're probably in trouble, but it's all subjective. The amateur sketch, what you're setting based on instinct, based on your ear, can be more powerful and emotionally moving than a professional, perfect, technical execution of a mix. And I know this is 100% true, and this is true too. There are songs you listen to on the radio that you absolutely hate. You're like, this is way too cookie cutter. I don't like this at all. It sounds like everything else I hear. And then maybe you're on YouTube and you go to a channel of somebody who is just singing without any experience mixing. They're just doing a cover song, but they've done such a phenomenal job. It's so raw, it's so emotional, and it sounds great. And I think you can apply the same idea to mixing. You don't have to be a professional to make a really powerful and moving mix. Yeah, it means that it may not make everybody happy. Yeah, it means that it may not play back great in the car stereo. But for some people, with whatever playback system they have, whatever they're listening to, it's going to move them. Whereas if you took the professional technical sheen, precise execution route, that person may turn it off. They may not enjoy it. And for me, doing this site and doing this project specifically, what I love about this more than anything else is hearing the way people do things different. Like, I don't want to hear another professional, technical, perfectly executed mix. I hear enough of that every single day. I hear that all the time. And if you do come up with that, that's totally cool. And it's great that you were able to get there. But I also love hearing the difference to what people just kind of do on instinct without getting into a habit, without getting into a routine of, okay, I want this to sound like everything else. Bing, bang, boom. That's how I do it. Because once you get into that routine, it can be very difficult to break out of it and go back to being very creative and having a little bit more self-expression. So it's true that over time, you'll eventually probably start to sound like everybody else, which is fine. It means you're getting better. But there's also something really amazing and special about just kind of working on instinct without thinking about all of the precise technical calculations and considerations that nowadays are made in a modern mix. So one last example here are two images, okay? This is John Constable. I'm sure many of you are familiar with his works. This is Sketch for a Leaping Horse, completed in 1824. And then if we move on to the next image, we have the actual leaping horse. So this was a sketch, this was a study for it, and then here was the final composition completed 1 year later. And the question I would ask you is, which of these two paintings do you prefer more? Okay. And I get the feeling like a lot of you might prefer this one. Some of you might prefer this one. I personally like the brushwork and I like the kind of fluidity that exists in this painting as compared to this one. This one's very technical. You really can see everything. It's almost like the detail has been added in. But there's also something really special about looking at this painting as well and kind of seeing his process and seeing the way that he's approaching painting. And I think mixing, you can have that exact same ideal and way of looking at it of, okay, here's one mix. Yeah, it's a little rough around the edges, but maybe that's what adds to its character. Maybe that's actually the X factor in that mix as compared to, say, what you're putting on your master bus. So here we are. We're going to look at the image sources for just a few seconds, and then we're going to jump in the DAW and just give you the real quick review rundown of the mixed pyramid in relationship to those routing options that we had discussed previously. Again, without listening to any actual audio, I just want to show you the mixed pyramid in context. So an example for how this would work. So you can see that we've already set everything up in terms of our groups, and inside here we have a bunch of different tracks. So our preparation has been done. We're ready to get in here and make our rough balance. So what this means is we would start by setting all of our rough balances between our various parts here, not even really worried or concerned with what's going on with the group levels right now. And you can see we have some groups nest within groups and so forth. So we'd go in listening to everything, setting everything based on its relative importance, fitting it in like so. We'd go through and get everything as we wanted. And at that point, we could then, of course, also go in after setting our balance and our pans and start to, put on some kind of effects. So let's say that we're putting an EQ here on the kick drum or something. So, okay, we'll put some gain, and then after the gain, we'll put a little bit of a cut, whatever. And we're going to be going through all of these plugins and tools and how to use them, but we could go through and do all of our effect processing on the individual tracks. Once we finished with the individual tracks, we could then go in and start processing on the group level. So you can see we have all of our various groups, and with the vocals, we have 2 additional subgroups as well. But let's say we're just focused on the drums for right now. I could go into the drums and I could, go ahead and put on some kind of, some kind of compressor, I guess, that's going to go on all of the drums together. So we're doing that group processing. We then might need to make some kind of a balance adjustment. At this point, we'd also go in and start to think about what's happening here on our various send and return. So if I want to send all of the vocals into the room reverb, I'd go in there and do it like so, but maybe with background vocals 1, I want to also have that going into some of the delay, okay? But specifically just for background vocals number 1, not all of them together. But if I wanted a little bit from all of them, I could go in and do it like so. Let's go and say, okay, I want these lead elements of the drum, the kick and snare, to go into the crush, but nothing else. So we'd send some of that like so. And only after we had finished and gotten everything sounding good on both the individual track level, so the foundation of the pyramid, and then the group level, what you see in the middle, would we then go on to the master and ask ourselves, do we need to do any additional processing here, which is going to impact everything, because as you can see, everything ultimately sends to the master. So with the vocal groups, the lead vocals are sending into the Vox master. And if I go even one step further, you'll see how the lead vocal is going into the lead Vox. The lead Vox feeds into the Vox all, which then eventually feeds into the master. So the point of showing you just is just to say that everything eventually goes to the master, where you can then process accordingly, and it's going to impact everything that's being fed into it. So we listen, we go, ooh, you know what? Maybe we want to put on some kind of very subtle and slight EQ, maybe add a little bit of a filter in there. Okay, we got, that's good to go. All right, I'm happy with that. That's maybe a little bit extreme. Whatever we want to do there. And then we go in and say, okay, we also need to maybe bring the volume up on this. So we throw in the loud max, bring down the output to 0.3, and then start to drive some gain in and do a little bit of peak limiting or peak reduction. And that's really the idea with the mix pyramid. So I just wanted you guys to see it in practice. And you'll probably be setting up something similar to this with your own mix, and just to make sure that you go from each level, starting with the foundation, working your way up then to the groups and send in returns, and then finally getting to the master level. And of course, we're going to be talking about all of this in much greater detail. Just at this point in the course, since I'm not doing this in the context of a full mix, it's going to be on just one or two audio tracks. But so you can recognize and see what it would look like in a full mix, that's why we have the example like it is here. And again, eventually in a bonus section, we probably will look at all of this stuff in context, but just to make your life a little bit easier, this is probably the way it's going to look, and this is how you're going to be applying your processing and really probably doing all of your mixes henceforth. So thank you for your attention, and let's start jumping in and getting into the nitty-gritty, the tools and the techniques, what I'm sure most of you have been waiting for this entire time.